Hey everybody. I had previously asked what you thought about me wearing headphones during these videos, and apparently you're all okay with it, so cool, thanks. And somehow I feel very close to the subject at hand. Lawyers? Who was your most evil client? Story 1. I'm not a lawyer, but I went to a technical high school, which was a high school that made you take technical courses like you would at a tech school to get a certification, i.e. plumbing, in that field. I got certified in investigation for taking criminal justice. When taking that class, we had to learn of all tiers of the justice system, tiers being the field, police, courtroom, and prison systems. So I can answer the question regarding the defense lawyers. See, most defense lawyers go into the career genuinely wanting to help innocently accused. However, because of our Constitution stating all deserve a fair trial, this is U.S., by the way, defense lawyers do have to give a fair fight to the defendant, whether or not they're actually criminal. Defense lawyers can turn down clients, but one has to remember that many of them actually go into public defense, which is meant to help those who cannot afford a lawyer. And if you go into public defense, you cannot turn down a client assigned to you by the court. You have to defend them. Because of this, even if people can afford lawyers, typically criminals will go public defense to guarantee representation. But most people cannot afford lawyers, please note. For those that manage to avoid or leave public defense to run their own firm, they usually do their best to choose clients that they actually sincerely believe to be innocent, or at least wrongly convicted. But you have to remember, too, that it's a job, and jobs are necessary for survival. So what happens if the firm has a drought point, which happens often, seeing as most people cannot afford a lawyer? Then they have to take on a case they may not normally because they need the money like everybody else. Hope that answered your question, and anyone else who was curious about it. Well, I was curious about the difference between defense lawyers and public defenders, true, but it's weird that we're starting with a story that no one has asked the question to yet. Little bizarre. What do you think? Are we going to run across the question later on in the video? Let's keep going. Story 2. Not a lawyer, but my uncle, let him rest in peace. Auto law lawyer specialized in stuff with cars, and he helped write the laws of lemon laws in Canada. He actually published a book that you can find on Amazon. Just don't remember the name. Anyway, so my uncle told the story about one of the most craziest cases he had. This was before I was born, maybe around the mid-'80s. So my uncle took a case surrounding a typical drunk driver case. I think DUI they call up in Canada as well. So the case was going smooth until the woman confessed to him. She may have also unalived somebody in blind rage when drunk. The person against a wall, and keep in mind this is the 80s. Cars are still the toughest tanks, possibly crushing the person. With this, my uncle was so disgusted. He may have requested to be pulled from the case, and since under Canada law you're not allowed to tell anyone until after maybe 10 years, he told us this maybe when I turned 9 or 10 years old. Now, as for the woman, he did get something from the courts stating that the woman, her charges were increased from DUI to potential manslaughter, causing her to be put in jail until possibly the year 2005. Don't know whatever happens. That woman, my uncle, never wanted to know, and he never accepts cases now that technically include manslaughter today. Well, before my uncle passed, he was a divorce lawyer and an auto claims lawyer. So yeah, my uncle saw some crazy stuff. Sorry about the cadence on that. For a minute there in the middle, punctuation seemed to disappear from that story. It was kind of hard to get the cadence of it. Kind of weird, but yeah, that's kind of weird that he got confessed to in the middle of the case. Did this person think that, oh, well, now that I've got him as my lawyer, he can't say no anymore? And it's kind of a weird story to tell a 9 to 10-year-old kid. I mean, I don't know how intelligent or wise this 9 or 10-year-old kid is if they were able to handle that kind of information. Anyway, Next one, story 3. I'm not a lawyer, but I used to work the court/crime beats at a small-town newspaper. I had to sit in on some awful trials. 2 guys were on trial for 2 separate unaliving/robberies, one being a triple homicide. The triple homicide case made me openly cry while sitting in the courtroom. These guys planned the robbery by having one of them go to the house and talk to the victim, then pretend he needed a glass of water from the kitchen. He opened the back door and let the other guy in. Within minutes, they'd unalived everyone in the house, including 2 young boys. While in prison, he agreed to make a full confession if the detective brought him McDonald's. In the middle of jury selection, he decided to do a bench trial instead, thinking he'd be looked on more favorably that way. As if the case itself wasn't heartbreaking enough, when the kid's grandfather read an impact statement to the court, the defendant started screaming and cursing at her, saying he hadn't unalived them because he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. He then tried to fight the kid's stepdad in the courtroom. Because he'd chosen a bench trial, the trial lasted less than a day, and the judge declared him guilty as soon as both parties had finished. He got 195 years in prison. During the sentencing, the judge said, "You are beyond rehabilitation, and you should never again see the light of day." That is awful. I don't think having a jury trial would have made any difference. Just the way he just couldn't even control himself in the courtroom. He was just guilty. What happened to the other person? Did he get unalived by the cops, or was his trial separate? There's nothing in there on that. Ugh. I don't think this forebodes very well for the joviality of the other stories in this video, but let's keep going. Story 4. My brother, who's a lawyer, corporate lawyer. Long since from this story, no details because closed courtroom, and he sticks by his word, so he literally won't go into details, but this comment is off of what he told me. Was sitting in on a defense of a case that turned out to be a child pervert. He said he was noticeably shaken up afterwards and asked the defense lawyer after, legitimately, as again he was considering going into criminal defense at the time, how she managed to defend someone so obviously guilty of this heinous offense. She simply replied, "Because someone has to. No matter how heinous the crime or how disgusting the defendant, everyone has the right to a proper defense and someone who will stand for them in court to look after their interests. Without that fundamental legal right, the criminal justice system could not function, as literally every trial would be a kangaroo court, as law is already stacked in the prosecution's favor if it makes it to court. That's what the defense is for, evening the scales, even if just a little." Note, not exact wording. This was both secondhand conversation and several years removed off memory. At the recommendation of one of his bosses while he was doing pre-bar exam work, he went into corporate law since he has the mind for it and really didn't want to go into criminal or family law. Story 5. All these things are horrible or worse. There are common people who do horrendous things that no one thinks twice about. People have children that they're not fit to raise in any way, and the harm they do affects the child to their unaliving at old age. The child is hurt, but society is damaged as a whole. An army of child perverts does less damage. People get into a position of power and they become passive best intent, or active malignant force of evil. Every decision is biased and harmful. It doesn't matter how small or large their position. They just foul everything up and leave misery in their wake. We have people writing fiction that has nothing to do with reality. People grow up believing what they see, and their life is a living embodiment of hypocrisy. There are people who literally are useless at everything in life and can't even do manual labor without messing things up. So what they do is become public leaders. They say they want to help humanity, but in truth, if the world's problems are fixed, they'd have nothing to do and would starve to death. We're forgiving of petty crime, But petty crime is like a million ants chewing away at a giant redwood tree. In no time, the tree is dead, and society would be dead too. We idolize the rich, but honesty and poverty almost never walk hand in hand. Story 6. I believe it was easier to claim insanity to avoid trial and sentencing a good time ago. However, now that psychiatry has advanced and laws rewritten, it's a double edge to claim insanity as a defense. First, a psychiatrist must determine if the person is sane enough to understand questioning and stable enough to reply. Any comprehension, and even if you have mental problems, you'll be deemed able to stand trial and sentencing. Here's the kicker to being successful in getting submitted to a psychiatric institute. There is no law limiting the max amount of time you are to stay there. You're put into psychiatric care with no hope of release unless the institution deems you're stable. Remember that they're being paid by the state for having you. Good luck that they'll actually be honest about your condition. Then, even if you manage to become stable, according to them, you'll be released into police custody, as you must still stand trial for your crime. None of the accrued time spent in the mental institution will count towards time served to whatever prison or jail sentence you're given. That last part didn't occur to me. The fact that you have to get stable enough and then you get handed over to serve time for whatever sentence you have for the crime committed. It's like that scene in The Princess Bride with the Pit of Despair where Wesley's getting healed up so he'll be healthy when he's put on the torture machine. Story 7. A local charity realized that it had never received a donation from the town's most successful lawyer. The volunteer in charge of contributions called him to persuade him to contribute. Our research shows that out of a yearly income of more than $600,000, you give not a penny to charity. Wouldn't you like to give back to the community in some way? The lawyer thought about it for a minute and replied, "First, did your research also show that my mother is dying after a long illness and has medical bills that are several times her annual income?" Embarrassed, the volunteer mumbled, No. Second, that my brother, a disabled veteran, is blind and confined to a wheelchair? The stricken volunteer began to stammer out an apology, but was cut off. Third, that my sister's husband perished in a horrific traffic accident? The lawyer's voice rising in indignation. Leaving her penniless with 3 children? The humiliated volunteer, completely beaten, simply said, "I had no idea." On a roll, the lawyer cut him off once again. "And I don't give them any deity damn money, so why should I give any to you?" Story 8. I still don't understand how people could just be such absolutely horrible monsters to others over the stupidest reasons. And when I heard the victim was trying to sing along with the neighbor as her daughter was on that call, that was just so heartbreaking to hear. Like, I managed to keep my composure for most of the video up until that part. But then I had to pause it for a second from there because wow. I'm just speechless because I don't even know what to say. The story didn't say what happened to the client, but I hope he got life without parole because that fact that he could do that to another human being for no good reason, that's absolutely despicable. I hope he rots in hell for what he's done. And it comforts me knowing people like him don't ever survive for long in prison. And as for the victim, I truly hope she can rest in peace. And I send condolences to that family, even though I don't know how long ago that was. Story 9. Hi, law student here who has worked in both defense and prosecution, and I just felt the urge to piggyback on what Mostly Facts guy said after the first story. It's always important to remember that no matter how awful the client, everybody in this country, United States of America, is guaranteed a right to representation by a lawyer. When you learn about the criminal justice system in America, you'll learn there is a whole bunch of powers that the government has that it can make it so easy to prove someone's guilt. So that right is a bedrock principle to ensure fairness and justice in the legal field. It's to ensure prosecutors present a strong and thorough case to the jury that can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Anything less than would completely decimate our system. And always remember, for every awful client in this video, there are probably a bunch more who are wrongfully accused, and the work of defense attorneys were the only thing that stood between them and unjust verdicts. Wait, what the Mostly Facts guy said after the first story? Was this taken from a previous video? I think it was my predecessor that they're talking about here. I'm a little confused. Again, we've got something where all these stories are kind of jumbled up here. Let's see if the next one can make any sense. Story 10. The defense lawyers for evil people are not there to get them off without charges. They're there to make sure the accusers have solid proof of everything they claim the defendant has done, so there's no false accusations, and to ensure that they get a fair punishment, instead of one that's too harsh. They're also there in case there are any factors that lessen the crime, like mental illness, or if the person acted on pure instinct, which might change what they get charged with, but not if they get charged. It's also just fair, with an objective law system that's supposed to give equal punishment for equal crime, no matter who it is, that both the accuser and defendant have someone on their side who can remain objective and know how the system works, like how lawyers talk weirdly in court, who talks when, that kind of stuff. But it can take a heavy toll to have to defend someone who's done horrible crimes. Much respect to those who can do it.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 11. I remember having to watch the lawyer of my uncle's unaliver talk about how his client was an exceptional student who never so much as shoplifted a piece of candy in his life and should not be given a long prison sentence for one mistake. He was driving drunk and hit my uncle when he was going home from a dinner with old army friends. My uncle's car was destroyed, and he did not survive. I nearly got in trouble for shooting a dirty glare at that lawyer, and I wanted so much just to take off my shoes and throw them at that snake. Thankfully, that driver was given 20 years because apparently it wasn't his only DUI. You have to be a sociopath to want to represent murderers, violators, and child perverts with evidence, because I don't think I can stomach standing next to a creep and say how they're innocent. Story 12. Just wanted to add a comment supporting defense lawyers, as they seem to get a lot of hate for defending bad guys. An absolute cornerstone of a solid justice system is that someone is entitled to a robust defense, even if the lawyer knows they're guilty, even if the client admits it to the lawyer. The lawyer's duty is to defend the case to the best of their abilities. If they refuse, throw or even half do their job, then it undermines the entire process. I can't imagine having a client that you desperately want to lose because they're a monster, but fighting for them anyway because something much bigger is at stake. I can see why a lot of defense lawyers switch out early. Edit to add, I'm mainly talking about criminal law. Civil cases are a bit different. We just seem to be getting more stories about defense of defense lawyers and the United States justice system, and not really many stories about who the most evil client is. I'm glad there's discussion, and in a way I'm kind of glad we don't have to have any really tragic stories throughout the whole video on this. It's good to have the open discussion on here. Let's keep going. Story 13. Upholding the right to representation is extremely important because if you make sure to uphold it for the extremely evil, it also ensures it's upheld for people like you and me. FBI director said it best. It's not enough to catch the criminal. We must do so while upholding his civil rights. It's not enough to stop the terrorist. We must do so while maintaining civil liberties. It is not enough to prevent foreign countries from stealing secrets. We must do so while upholding the rule of law. It's not a question of conflict. It's a question of balance. The rule of law, civil liberties, and civil rights. These are not our burdens. These are what make all of us safer and stronger. That being said, our system still has immense flaws. Story 14. It's my right as a man to sleep with any woman I'd like, even if she is underage or just entered adulthood, because that's how God built men types are ones I know would get me fired if I went into lawyering. You need a thick skin to go into that field, since you're often subjected to witness the worst of humanity in there. Criminals may be dumb to think they can hide their crimes, but when you look deep into their thought processes and why they think they have the right to do what they do, you'd want to run away. It's honestly why, even though I have an interest in psychology, I don't go deep into it or took it seriously as a profession. Story 15. In regards to the psych facility, it's worse because it's more mental trauma and the time you spent there can be longer than if you were to be sentenced for the crime. What I don't understand is why prisoners don't bother to better themselves. You're in prison because you committed a crime. got caught, and sentenced. In the time you're in prison, you could be making efforts to improve yourself and your situation. Prison shouldn't be about waiting out your sentence with a few activities. There are books to read if you just ask for them. Every prisoner should be given a Bible, New King James Version at least. There's a chance they may convert or reject it with hostility and hate. Either way, they should still receive the chance. I'm not sure if this is going to be a blanket statement that's going to cover every prisoner. I don't know all that much about the prison system, but I do know that all facilities aren't the same. And I think it also depends on what type of security that you're in. You might not have access to everything to improve yourselves. Maybe not all those opportunities. Maybe you're just put to work a lot. Maybe you don't have access to the books that you want. Maybe you're in solitary. You just don't know. I think there are opportunities for some prisoners, but I think part of it is that all you have is time. Story 16. Due to funding cuts and cuts in compassion during the 90s, most states closed down their traditional mental hospitals. Patients who used to be kept locked away forever were released en masse and told to use outpatient mental health resources. Very, very few people remain committed, and still few today get committed. There simply are very few old-school mental health facilities. Virtually nobody gets committed anymore. This is why the gun background checks looking to see if the buyer had been committed don't help. Almost nobody gets committed anymore. Anyway, the Story 13 perp was probably released when their facility was closed. They might have been sent to prison, but it's unlikely. Story 17. Yeah, no, they understand just fine. Being abused doesn't make it so that you don't realize it's wrong to carjack and assault people. Just know. And please don't feel bad about having emotions, as others are stating. I'd be quite worried about you if you could do this for any length of time and have it not get to you. Take care of yourself and get a break from this material now and then. I find watching bug documentaries very soothing. They don't usually contain politics. Bugs are not really malicious, and their little alien world is so different from our own it doesn't remind me of unpleasant topics. Story 18. I can shed some light on this subject. I work in a firm. In my firm, if the attorney sees you are clearly guilty, they will reject you on principle. Now, public defenders, they have to take the case. It's rare that they are reassigned to a different case. Most of the time, they're told to suck it up, even if it goes against their morals or religious beliefs. The attorney can be fired and blackballed, which is really awful. That's how they get them to defend pieces of junk people. Most of the time, public defenders absolutely hate the client. Story 19. So when attorneys take a client or appointed a client by the court, they are ethically and legally obligated to represent that attorney to the best of their ability. Even though the attorney, me, absolutely hates that person and wish them to unalive in prison, they are ethically and legally obligated to do everything in their power to defend said client to the best of our abilities. Some attorneys don't get the luxury of saying, "No, I won't represent you," as in some cases they're appointed by the state for whatever reason, or the course you know. Story 20. Not a lawyer. I was, thankfully briefly, on a jury for a case where two men potioned and then had non-consensual relations with a person in a bar and then a condo. The victim had been extremely traumatized by what happened. I remember looking into the eyes of the accused in open court while being questioned for jury duty, and it was like looking into someone with a black void for a soul. What was really messed up was the accused, after being convicted, only got 9 years each for all of the charges they were convicted of. Story 21. I'm not sure what evidence they had for the uncle who spent special uncle time with his niece, but if they had none and she was the only witness and couldn't testify, then there would be nothing to prosecute on. Unfortunately, when victims can't testify, this kind of stuff happens. Without knowing any more about it, I find it hard to blame the jury. Even when you know in your gut that a perpetrator did the crime, you can't convict on nothing. This lawyer lady surely knows this if she's a lawyer. Story 22. Those people who say you can rehabilitate everyone needs to hear some of these and think long and hard about it. My grandmother was against the unaliving penalty until she was gang violated in college and her sister unalived afterward in front of her. They got 10 years. Just 10 years. Then they got out and did it again, but this time they unalived 3 women to get rid of witnesses. Oh, and they admitted they were looking for her. Story 23. My uncle's best friend met a girl at a bar once about 40 years ago. She brought him back to her place, where her husband met him with a shotgun and threatened to blow his brains out if he didn't have intimacy with his wife in front of him. He then kicked him out of their house naked and called the cops, claiming violation. Went to court and everything. The bartender at the bar testified, and he was found not guilty. Story 24. Attorney-client privilege should be dissolved the minute judgment is passed in a case. An attorney should be legally required to write a report of the whole case, their strategy, and anything revealed by the now former client. Omissions and lies should result in criminal charges, not just being disbarred. To make this work, lawyers should only be allowed to represent any client in one criminal matter and then be disbarred from working with them again. Story 25. I'm sure my dad has plenty of stories he can't tell from being a witness to cases he worked at a state penitentiary. While he worked at the only prison in our state, some messed up people were sent there, even from out of state. If you can imagine a horrible crime, chances are my dad saw a handful during his time as a guard. Story 26. I take exception to the assertion that life in a psychiatric hospital is hell. I'm a psych nurse, and this hasn't been true since the 80s. We treat our patients with respect and compassion and care for their rights as human beings. Story 27. These people have to be represented because sometimes innocent people are charged. It's better that 1,000 guilty go free than have one innocent suffer unjustly. Story 28. I couldn't be a criminal attorney. 1, I'd be at a moral crossroads, and 2, I'd probably be good at it, making problem 1 worse.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.